Welcome to another edition of Money Talk with Melanie. I'm your business diva, Melanie Collette. We're broadcasting live from the lovely, beautiful Cape May, New Jersey. And it is indeed beautiful today. And we are also streaming live via SHR Media and on Facebook. And I'd like to welcome first one to the Facey Chat. I feel like I should give some kind of prize or something for the first one to the Facey Chat. Maybe I'll start doing that. Maybe I'll get a Money Talk with Melanie t-shirt or one of these beautiful mugs from my sponsor, Biz Social Personal Touch. And Victor, welcome. Paul, Alex, hello, welcome. Happy Friday to you. I hope you all have a meaningful Memorial Day weekend and reflect on what it means and sacrifices that have been made on behalf of our freedom. It is just... I'm amazed that people volunteer and are willing to go and fight for us, for our precious freedoms that we, take for granted. I think about how people live in a lot of other countries and think about the fact, the lack of rights that they have and the freedom that I have to have a podcast and talk about whatever I want. And it's because people have paid the ultimate sacrifice for that. So I hope that you all have a meaningful Memorial Day and are thinking about that as you are picking up that drumstick or whatever it is that you're enjoying this weekend. And I am by the beach, as you all know, and within like 5 miles of 4 beaches. And what that means is that the onslaught of tourists have begun, and I have to make a decision tonight to either lock myself down in my place or run. But I need to make that decision probably tonight, or I will likely be stuck here because there's so many tourists. Welcome to the Facey Chat, Doug, my unpaid publicist, Bobby, Jill St. Vincent. Good to see you. Welcome all of you to Money Talk with Melanie. My guest tonight is Jim Mosquera. I hope I am pronouncing his name correctly. I will allow him to correct me. I ask him to correct me once I bring him on the show if I am incorrect. He's a consultant and author, and he's going to talk to us about his book, Escaping Oz, An Observer's Reflection. Now, I know that's an odd title. You're like, what in the world is that about? Why is she having him on the show? You will not regret this. Trust me. He's going to be fantastic. Talks about everything economics, politics, how they intersect, what economics means to you, what finance means to you. I'm excited about having this guy on the show. And if you are not familiar with his books, I believe this is his third in a series of Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflections. I'm going to post a link so that you guys can take a look. If you are listening via the Facey Chat, I'm going to post a link because the book is indeed sold on Amazon. So I'm going to post a link right there because you can look at the first few pages and all that good stuff. I would definitely check that out. But when I started reading some of the book, I was like, oh, my audience is going to love this guy. And so I think it's going to be an interesting interview, and I'm super duper excited about that. Unfortunately, the show is only going to be 1 hour tonight because my second guest had to cancel. I want to be totally mad and upset about that. I do. I want to be devastated. But you all know what I do for a living, right? You know that I teach teenagers financial literacy all day. Kim Sharp, welcome to the Facey Chat. Susan Tui. Jim is in the Facey Chat. You all know what I do for a living. You know that I teach teenagers financial literacy and computers and web page design. Fortunately, my college kids are already off enjoying their summer. But a sister could use an early break into the weekend, I guess is what I'm trying to say. So, unfortunately, and we've had Chris on before, Chris Prefontaine. So, I will have Chris Prefontaine back on the show. I promise you that. Okay, that's for real. So that's going to happen. And he's been on the show before, and he will return. If you were not signed up for my newsletter, by the way, because I just kind of revamped my contact list via Money Talk with Melanie, message me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, wherever. Email me at moneytalkwithmelanie.com and I'll add you to the list. That way you know who the upcoming guests are. I always give people, first of all, I give you links to shows that you may have missed. And I also give you a preview of who's coming up over the next 4 weeks. So those people who are on my mailing list know who's coming up on Money Talk with Melanie for the next month or so. And I have my guests booked out to, I don't know, mid-July sometime. Yeah, I'm very excited about that. The show has been quite blessed. Welcome, Chris. Welcome, Eric. I hope you don't mind me tagging you. Ron Edwards, I knew I was forgetting to tag someone. It was Ron Edwards. Welcome to the Facey Chat. A little bit of Money Talk news report. I know you guys know, unless you've been under a rock, that the Trump administration just approved a $16 billion bill to help farmers that are struggling because of the, I don't want to say tariff war just yet, but what is definitely leading up, right now it's kind of a tariff skirmish with the Chinese, but it's definitely having an economic impact on the farmers, particularly in the soybean sector of the market. So that's a problem, and President Trump is seeking to fix it with this $16 billion with a $B bill. Now, of course, people are arguing semantics, whether or not, he's like, the Chinese are paying for it because the tariffs are so high. And listen, it's you guys know how it is. When you're talking about money, are they paying for it directly? No. But is the money being replaced? I would argue that that's an argument, particularly considering how the government counts money. Let's talk about it for a second. I'll remind you who have never heard the show before that when a government says that they're cutting the budget, what they mean is they're not increasing the budget for next year. When we cut our budgets at home, what we do is we actually say we're going to spend less. That's not what the government does. The government says we cut the budget when they decide not to incrementally, arbitrarily, really, in my opinion, increase the budget just based on things like inflation and the fact that we're just going to need more of your money. And they call that cutting the budget. So, if this is the kind of buffoonery and magic trickery that the government uses to count money, I think that Donald Trump is well within, and Jim might disagree with me, but not from a technical sense, not from a technical financial CPA kind of sense, but from a philosophical perspective, I think we can say the Chinese are paying for it. That's all I'm saying, from a philosophical perspective. Now, would I teach my accounting kids that? No. If I was teaching accounting next year, if they put that on my schedule, I will hurt someone because I hate teaching accounting. But I've taught it before, and it's kind of fun. Business accounting's fun. But anyway, I wouldn't tell my accounting kids that was okay because obviously that'd be wrong. But philosophically, that's correct. It's a correct assumption. This was interesting. According to the Federal Reserve, even though the job market is tightening, like there's literally more jobs available than can be filled, people still have trouble coming up with $400 in an emergency fund. And if you listen to folks like Dave Ramsey and anybody who will give you basic personal finance advice, they say that you should have 3 months of saving, 3 months worth of bills saved up as your emergency fund. And I think that's pretty good, darn good financial advice. And $400 doesn't cover people's rent. And they're saying that people that a large number of Americans have a hard time even coming up with that much for an emergency fund. And that's a concern. But I think that concern is not so much economic, but personal finance habits and people just being short-sighted and not sticking to it. And that's just, my experience as a financial consultant says that. Let's just put it that way. You talk to people about life insurance and they're like, huh? And then suddenly somebody dies and they're passing around a hat. Does not make any sense. Okay. You're listening to Money Talk with Melanie. I'm your business diva, Melanie Collette. It's 5:15 Eastern Standard Time. My guest today is Jim Mosquera. He's a business consultant and author. Very excited to talk to him about all things economics, politics, finance, and everything in between. I am very excited to have him on the show today. And up next, a brand new Ron Edwards notebook coming your way right now.
President Trump is correct in his decision to stand up to China, but are tariffs the only way to show that he means business? Hello, I'm Ron Edwards. On today's page from the Edwards Notebook, for decades, China has been allowed to take full advantage of the United States via trade deals that favored that nation. As a result, China has imposed unfair tariffs against U.S. products since the 1980s. The Chinese government is predatory in its ongoing efforts to steal intellectual property and harvest the fruits of freedom while imposing a brutal communist dictatorship over the Chinese people and threatening Taiwan. Yes, tariffs are a good way to hit back at China. I believe that slapping a huge carbon tax on every single product China exports to our republic would not only contribute to the reduction of the trade deficit, but also bring more needed attention to China being the number one polluter of the Earth's environment, whether it's plastics in the ocean or unchecked burning of dirty unfiltered coal. So keep up the good work, Mr. President, and also utilize a carbon tax on Chinese products, and use the surplus to help our U.S. farmers. I'm Ron Edwards. Join me Fridays at 4 p.m. Eastern, 1 p.m. Pacific on AmericaMatters.us and catch a page from the Edwards Notebook on our newest affiliate Saturdays on AM 1600 WAAM, Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Sponsored by David E. Garrett Jewelers.
Making a living can be tough these days with so many jobs going overseas. If you love numbers and puzzles and want job security, you can become a tax specialist with an amazing 6-month tax course from Tax Mama. Operate your own tax practice locally or anywhere in the world where there are American taxpayers. It's a great way to write off your trips to visit family for months at a time. Everything you need to pass the IRS 3 special enrollment examinations is included in this course. Visit irsexams.school. And if you need more than 6 months, that's okay. Take your time. You're in the course until you pass the exams or until you unsubscribe and reject Tax Mama's emails.
Right now, you can get the credit you deserve. Just visit MrCreditRepair.biz. Let their expert credit repair specialists remove late payments, charge-offs, collections, even old bankruptcies fast and easy. That's MrCreditRepair.biz. Why go anyplace else? Increase your credit score today. At Mr. Credit, you always get a quality service, all at our everyday discounted price. Stop getting turned down for cars, credit cards, or even new homes. Visit MrCreditRepair.biz today. That's MrCreditRepair.biz. Your credit repair is our #1 priority.
And we're back. You're listening to Money Talk with Melanie. I'm your business diva, Melanie Collette. Charles Gasparino's name just popped up on the Facey thread. If he's actually watching, I want to give him a shout out. Love your work, dear. Oh, Lee Park, welcome. Tasha, Kira Ennis, how are you, darling? Levon Wilson, how are you? I just tagged someone who's calling me right now who probably wants to talk to me about something political. Mr. Jeff Booker, I just tagged you in the Facey chat because I wanted you to know that I'm on the air right now. So stop calling me. My guest the first hour is Jim Mosquera, business consultant and author. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He has a unique profile with degrees in industrial engineering, a business background in telecommunications and networking, and a self-developed knowledge of economics and financial markets. He's a principal at Sentinel Consulting, a business finance and debt restructuring firm. He's also a nonfiction author who's published 3 nonfiction books in the Escaping Oz series. He's also the author of the thriller Chandler Scott thriller series. Featuring politics and a financial crisis and cyber terror. That sounds exciting. The thriller series gives a chilling, realistic look at the nation's future. I'm so excited to introduce to you Jim Mosquera. How are you?
Hey, Melanie. Great to be on with you today.
Oh, I'm so glad to have you. I hope my introduction was okay and I didn't mess it up. I didn't mess it up too much.
No, I'll take it. That was a good one.
Okay, very good. Excellent. Well, listen, is there anything that I left out of your profile or your bio that you'd like to tell the audience?
Well, one thing that I tell people, it's like one of those things, something that you don't know about me is I'm originally not from the United States. I'm from the Republic of Panama, which is that country that connects Central America to South America.
Nice. Very nice. All right. That they don't typically put that in the bio, do they? So are you?
No, and like I said, that's one of those icebreaker questions. When they ask you, what's something that we would know, what we don't know about you that you think might be interesting? And to follow that up, my first language that I ever spoke that came out of my mouth that was intelligible was actually Spanish and not English.
Stop that! Really?
Yeah.
Excellent. I'm liking it already. Okay. I'm like, no, but you would never. How did you manage to not get? Is this too personal of a question? How did you manage not to have it?
I mean, what happens is if you learn a language at an early enough age, I think it kind of gets rid of the accent. And that's one thing that I guess an advantage that I had was learn Spanish first, obviously, so that's my native language, but I learned English at a young enough age to where it really flattened out any semblance of an accent. And I don't think, I've been told this as well, I don't have much of an accent in Spanish either. So I think I have a pretty flat accent in both languages.
That's amazing. Because I would have never, like, usually you can tell if someone's from a Spanish-speaking country or if Spanish is, I'm a teacher, so if it's an ELA, if English is a second language, you can usually tell. But I can't tell at all, and I don't know if that's wow, that's amazing that you were able to do that. Okay. I want to talk about one of the. First of all, let's talk about the Escaping Oz series and the title of Escaping Oz, because the Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflection is the third of 3 books. So I want to talk about Escaping Oz conceptually, because I think that's an important point before we get into the other really interesting topics, like who's more financially savvy, men or women, or something like that.
Okay.
So talk about that, please.
Well, the premise of Escaping Oz, and as you mentioned, Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflections is the third book in the series. I started with the premise that we, as I'll call ourselves, economic animals, have been transported to this financial land of Oz. I don't want the readers or your listeners to think that necessarily that there's like a really, really strong relationship between things that I wrote about in the Escaping Oz series and the Wizard of Oz characters. There are some notions that I try to draw some parallels between things that have occurred and things in the Wizard of Oz. But if you know the story of the Wizard of Oz, well, what happened? Dorothy gets swept up with Toto in a tornado, and she ends up in this magical land. And what I try to liken is that us as an economy, we've kind of been swept up, and you could argue when the tornado actually occurred and when we got catapulted to the land of Oz. But we eventually kept following the Yellow Brick Road, and if you remember what happened in the Wizard of Oz movie, when Toto, when the wizard was presented to Dorothy, he was this very powerful character that was just billowing smoke and fire and had this deep voice, and obviously was a very intimidating character. And the wizards, if you will, in my books, are people that are in charge of that. Let's say guide our financial markets and the economy, and more often than not, it falls within the realm of people that are involved in central banking in the United States, Federal Reserve Bank, in Europe, obviously European Central Bank. You've got Bank of England. Any central bank entity would fall within the realm of the wizards. You also have people within government. So the parallel, the metaphor, if you will, of the wizard in the Wizard of Oz is these very powerful beings. And for us as just general consumers, that's how we tend to view these entities in government, and especially in the Federal Reserve and the central bankers. But if you remember in the movie, what did Toto do towards the end of the movie? He pulled back the curtain. And then when he pulled back the curtain, the person that was revealed was an ordinary man. And that's what the wizard actually told Dorothy. I'm just an ordinary man. He was sitting behind this curtain, pulling levers and pushing buttons and creating, this theater. And that's what I want to try to convey within the series of books, is that we have conveyed a certain amount of power to people that operate within the boundaries of central banking. And if you remember back in the days of the Maestro, as Alan Greenspan was called, and after that, you had Ben Bernanke, every time that someone from the Federal Reserve, particularly the chairman, would testify before Congress, a lot of it was very unintelligible. And, people were just sitting there, investors, the investing community, Wall Street was sitting there with bated breath, just waiting to see what the Grand Wizard would say. And I bring up an example in the book that you featured earlier, was that when Alan Greenspan proposed to his girlfriend at the time, and she's a very well-known TV personality by the name of Andrea Mitchell, who works for NBC,
Yes.
His proposal to her was so convoluted that she did not realize that he was proposing to her. Now think about that for a second. When a man's proposing to a woman, it shouldn't come as, you shouldn't have to interpret the proposal, right? It either is or is not. And that is something that I actually took from a book that was written by Bob Woodward called Maestro. And so the point that I made in this last book was that imagine if you have a central bank chairman who's proposing to his girlfriend, and even she didn't understand what he was talking about. That's the sort of language sometimes that tends to come out of the Federal Reserve, that then people have to deign what it is that they're talking about. The financial markets then try to make an interpretation, and then we look at keywords like the word patient that they've been using recently. Well, what does patient mean? And so there's definitions that get spun around that. So if you just look at the whole Escaping Oz series, it's kind of pulling back the curtain. And by the way, toto, the word toto is actually Latin for everybody or all. And then that's what I want people to do. I want my books to allow you to pull back the curtain, look at the wizard, see all the buttons that are being pushed and the levers that are being pulled, and understand really what's going on. And it's not, these people have been, accorded these special powers, at least we have, and we think that they operate kind of like sprinkling fairy dust on the economy, and that's not really what happens.
Oh my goodness. You said a mouthful there. You really did. And it's so true. People don't look at even money as a realistic thing, or the federal bank as a realistic thing, or the White House or the presidency or any of those things that you spoke about as a real tangible, entities that they are. Like that the Fed is an actual organization and group of people. Privately owned, by the way. Scary.
Right.
But that's all. And you're like, wait a minute, wait. For those of you who are listening to this via download, or you're listening to the show live, and you heard me just say that the Federal Reserve is privately owned, and you're scratching your head saying, I don't know what I'm talking about. Yes, I know what I'm talking about. That is absolutely true. And it's scary. Why?
And again, that's the general theme of the books, which is to convey information, to again pull back the curtain, because that's what Toto did, and Toto is everybody, and I want everybody. I mean, obviously not everybody, but I'd like a lot of people to read the book so they understand it. And the third book, Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflections, tells you what happens with all of this power that's been concentrated within the wizards and the things that they're doing, their impacts on the economy, their impacts on things that affect us socially. And I even went so far as to talk about what developed in the 2016 election, why it developed the way it did. I actually talked about, in my first book that came out in 2010, how you would see not necessarily third parties that would come out, but you would see people that would have, third party like characteristics about them, and that they would appear in politics. And that was a byproduct, if you will, of the intervention in the economy, again, by the wizards, and some of the, let's say, social and economic imbalances that had occurred. And that's why today, and actually I'll just go back to 2016. In 2016, I identified 3 candidates that were running for president that did not fit any of the particular political molds within either the Democratic Party or the Republican Party. And the 3 candidates were Dr. Ben Carson, who people probably don't remember, but he actually led in some of the early polls when that group of 16 Republicans assembled, I guess, to run for president. The second one was Bernie Sanders, who, as you know, he caucuses with the Democrats, is considered an independent, right, but he declares himself to be a democratic socialist. And then the third candidate, if you will, was the current 45th president of the United States, who didn't fit in any particular mold either. And it's something that still kind of puzzles me, how I think a lot of the journalists in this country have tried to identify him really strongly with the Republican Party. And I think honestly that's not something that he's had like particular allegiance to. I mean, mean, he's a businessman.
Exactly.
I think he's a lot more pragmatic than I think people really give him credit for. And if you go back into the psychology of who he is and so forth, and I understand that he obviously is a very, very controversial character, but getting back to my point, those three candidates that I just identified were byproducts of what has been occurring. I could start it out maybe around 1971. They materialized because the electorate wanted it. They weren't being listened to by either party, if you will, and that's why you see, Donald Trump that didn't fit into the Republican mold real well. Remember, in 2016, we had a movement within the Republican Party that was called what? Never Trump. The Republican Party himself didn't want it. Bernie Sanders is not, particularly liked by the Democratic Party. How do we know that? Because we saw what happened in 2016 with the DNC. Very likely he might have been the nominee. And what would have happened if you would have had a Bernie Sanders versus a Donald Trump runoff in 2016? That would have been a very interesting outcome. And it's an outcome that potentially may happen in 2020. So all of these things that you see now socially and politically are a direct result of what has occurred, financially and economically over, say, the last 45 to 50 years.
I couldn't agree with you more. I was reading over like the first part of your book as I was doing show prep today, and I was like, if I didn't know that this was coming from a pragmatic perspective, I would think you were borderline prophetic. But it really is. Well, I'm serious.
Well,
but it's really.
Here's one thing that I like to tell people is, when people ask me, well, are you a conservative or liberal, Democrat, and so forth? And I tell them that I don't identify with any party. I'm not registered in any party. But when you read my bio, I think you mentioned that, I have degrees in engineering. And I think what's important about that is, engineers by nature, they try to solve problems. I mean, that's how I was trained. It's like, okay, there's a problem, you got to solve it. And in my particular case, it was more focused on solving business problems. But over the course of time, as I got more familiar with the financial markets and really taught myself, which I think was important because it allowed me to kind of guide my knowledge base where I wanted to, not necessarily where a textbook would guide me. I realized that there were some root causes, if you will, to a lot of the things that we struggle with today. And until we really address those root causes, you're going to continue to see a spiral, if you will, towards, more and more economic and financial problems, which invariably, it's almost impossible to separate those from social problems. And that's why in my books, in the three books, I always talk about the intersection of politics and economics, because you can't separate them.
Oh, no, I completely agree. And I saw that you were an engineer. And as I was reading the portion of your book that I read, I was like, yep, I can see that now. My bestie is an engineer, and she happens to be the president of the organization I was telling you about off air, pre-production. And yes, the way she does things is very, problem solving, get it done, without all that's an engineer's, she's a chemical engineer. So, if she doesn't get her stuff right, stuff blows up. So it's a problem. So, but, that engineering mind, I actually have there's another woman that's in a leadership in an organization that's also an engineer, different type of engineer, civil engineer, I think. And same thing, the way you all's mind thinks, that I could see it in the book, and even just the way you analyzed and just broke down The Wizard of Oz and drew those parallels, I thought was very important and very apt too to the way the entire thing works. Quite honestly.
Well, and I think that what's also important about my books that I hope people read them realize is that they don't have any particular any political slant to them.
No.
And I think that's important because I don't want somebody to start reading one of my books and say, oh, well, he's just, and then, you fill in the blank with whatever political identification they want to label me with. And hopefully when you read it, you see that it's very objectively written. It's meant to address some root causes, and it tells you why certain things are occurring. And, I watch national news every day. I see what happens on Fox News. I see what happens on CNN. I mean, I actually do watch both of them because it's important for me to kind of see what both sides are saying. And there's many times that I wish I was on either network and say, no, I mean, what you're saying here is not accurate,
right,
and it's not objective. And that's why, when you read the opening of Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflections, I say that, the American society has no political center, that we've got a political distribution that looks like a camel's humps. You got
Yes.
a hump on the left and a hump on the right and a little baby bump in the middle. And then that hollowing out of the middle, makes the whole issue of compromise, whether it's legislative compromise or any other political compromise, incredibly difficult. And it's that middle, because that middle is hollowed out, that's where the objectivity is reached. And the other thing I mentioned in my book, which maybe we'll get into a little bit later in the interview, is when we identify political parties today, we think, okay, conservative and liberal, and my contention is that the way we use the word liberal today is incredibly different as to how it was originally defined. And I actually I put a book trailer together for this book, and I show you a political spectrum, and I say, over here on one end is what I'll call complete anarchy, which means that nobody's in charge of anything. On the other end, you have what I call the isms, and that could be communism, fascism, socialism, etc. And when the country was founded, the founding fathers had us closer to the anarchy side. We weren't anarchists, but I'm just saying we were closer to that side than we were to the isms. Over the course of time, the whole political spectrum of the United States has drifted towards the isms. And that's Republican and Democratic parties. It's not just one or the other. And so when people now say, well, somebody is a liberal, well, a liberal meant that you embraced liberty. That was the original definition. And something close to that today would be, okay, well, if you identify as a libertarian, then in theory you're closer to what the original intention and definition of liberty was. But liberal today just means more of an identification with one party than the other. And conservative, likewise, is the same thing. My contention is both parties have drifted towards the isms. And in the book, I go to great pains to show you why that's the case and some of the unintended consequences of government becoming bigger. And a really, really key point in the book, Melanie, if somebody wants to get a key point out of the book, which is understanding what the difference is between freedom from and freedom of.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you. I can't wait to get to that part in the book. But that is, first of all, one of the things that you say in the opening is about the lack of critical thinking that exists in society today. And what you just said is critical thinking 101. The difference between freedom of and freedom from. And it is regularly conflated by everyone, but the media, I believe, does it on purpose. To manipulate.
And I think what's happened is because people don't understand that, when we talk about freedom of something, we look at the Constitution or Bill of Rights, and that's really where, we embody what those freedoms of are. What's happened over time, and probably one identifying point that just immediately comes to mind is if you listen to some of the speeches that Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, made during his time in office, you start to hear the term freedom from. Well, once you start to espouse freedom from, it automatically means that somebody has to provide that freedom. In other words, it's not the inalienable freedom that is guaranteed by us within the Constitution, that in theory is handed. Well, let me just leave it at that. When you talk about freedom from, it means that there's an entity that has to be able to provide that freedom. And FDR talked about a certain freedom from want. Well, that's not what the Constitution talked about. The Constitution talked about you having freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of assembly, and those other things that are ensconced within the Bill of Rights. Well, when you talk about freedom from, it means something totally different. And in order to guarantee or provide those freedom froms, it inevitably means that the government, at whatever level you want to call it, whether it's federal, state, or local, has to provide that for you. Well, government can't do that for free, which means that as taxpayers, we are more greatly burdened, or as future taxpayers and residents of this country, you have further debt that you have to be associated with. And every time that you ask for freedom from, government's always very eager to provide it for you, as well as politicians. It costs money. It costs money to do that. You've got to create a bureaucracy to handle that freedom from that you're going to be providing. More than likely, at a federal level, you don't have the money to do that, so you have to borrow it. And then the last thing that I want to mention is that there are always unintended consequences associated with providing that freedom from. And then we don't realize that it was an association with providing the freedom from, so we create more legislation to try to redress what we created initially. And then it becomes a cycle, right? And it's a never-ending cycle. And that's why, it's very, very difficult to ever envision that you're going to, the whole notion of a balanced budget, and you were talking about that earlier about, what it means when government decreases, it's really, it's a reduction in the rate of acceleration.
Right.
That, it's really impossible for me to conceive of a point where, okay, well, you're going to have a balanced budget and you're actually going to reduce the debt. Because that's, A, monetarily, it's not going to happen. And then B, as long as we keep espousing the freedom from, inevitably it means government has to provide it. It costs money, more bureaucracy, and so forth. And again, there's always unintended consequences.
Indeed. I will tell you, I have a business, undergraduate degree and a master's. My master's is in public administration, and my undergrad is in business, right? And the two types of budgeting are different. So when you learn public budgeting and public administration, they budget with a deficit. I wanted to scream. I literally had a project where I built a budget with the assumption that I was going to spend more than I was taking in. I was livid. I was livid. I didn't even know how to handle it. I'm like, why? I don't understand why we're doing this. Why are we doing this?
And that's a great point you bring up, because if you did that, let's say at a state or local level, you don't have the same means of, I'll use the word money printing loosely, but you don't have the same means of mone printing that they do at the federal level.
Right.
I'll give you a real personal example right now. I submitted my taxes for state and federal right around mid-March, if you will. I got my federal refund, maybe about a week, 10 days later. I still do not have my state refund. Okay, and I live in the state of Missouri. That shows you what happens, with cash flow on a state level, which again, their ability to raise capital in the capital markets, in this case the debt markets, very, very different than what the federal government can do. And because the federal government can raise capital in such a, I'll just use a frictionless manner, it always allows, for, right now we're not operating under any sort of debt ceiling, right? We had a debt ceiling and then they lifted it, and so now there is no debt ceiling. And so the whole notion of the debt ceiling is really sort of funny, because it's nothing that really means anything, and this could go on to another discussion about how the federal debt, the fact that it's $22 trillion and growing, really has no upper bound to it right now that's set forth either by our monetary system or any sort of fiscal discipline on the part of politicians.
Fiscal discipline? What's that? The debt ceiling is I swear, it's like the dad who has a 16-year-old daughter who keeps asking for their credit card to get extended, and he swears that this is going to be the last time, little girl. And then sure enough, she overspends and comes back and says, "Daddy, I need more money." He says, "Okay, I'll lift your credit card availability another few $1,000s." It's ridiculous.
Well, and Dad can do that up to a point, but I guess my point about on a federal level is there is no friction for the federal government to raise capital, and a term that you're going to be hearing more about, and if my kind of my prognostication of how I see the economy going and who might be elected our next president it comes to fruition, you're going to be hearing a lot more about something called modern monetary theory, or MMT, which really advocates that there is, when I say there's very little friction, and under modern monetary theory, there's zero friction to create any sort of amount of money that you need to finance anything that the government wants to do. And I am very, very confident that that's something that may come to fruition, particularly if the person that wins the next election sounds a lot like Bernie Sanders. I know who his economic advisor is. I've read her papers. Her name is Stephanie Helton, I think is her last name. And I know exactly what she's going to do. And I know how she's advising him. And I know that whoever represents the Democratic Party in the 2020 election, that will be the economic theory that they espouse. And why I think that's going to be at least a prevalent point of discussion in economic circles in Washington D.C. is because it's going to be a reaction. Remember, we talked earlier about the wizards getting involved, government getting involved. There's a bureaucracy and there's unintended consequences. Well, when the bailouts came in 2008 in the economy, Main Street really wasn't the beneficiary of that. It was Wall Street, and I can show you statistical information to prove that out. Well, I talked earlier about how you have these social and economic imbalances, and the population, and particularly whoever gets elected in 2020, even if it is our current president, there's going to be far less of an appetite for the next economic contraction to say, oh, well, we're going to bail out Wall Street and the banking industry again. Now what's going to happen is they're going to say, well, we need to bail out Main Street. Well, how do you bail out Main Street? Well, you have the government directing much more of the GDP via whatever expenditures they're going to have. Whether that's infrastructure, whatever it is that they come up with, can only be financed via mechanisms what you'll see in will be called MMT, modern monetary theory. So that's probably coming to a theater near you, probably in a few years, if not sooner.
Well, I can't argue with that. And I mean, I would almost assert that we're at the very beginnings of that with the bill to help the farmers that we were talking about earlier, that I talked about in the open.
Yeah,
I mean, that's like an
you mentioned that earlier, and I'm glad you mentioned that, not to particularly isolate on what's going on with the tariffs and the bill for the farmers, but one thing that I have never heard anybody talk about is, since the 2016 election, if you will, we have these statistical measures in the economy like unemployment, gross domestic product to a certain degree, and they're all pretty darn good. Stock market as well, interest rates still near historical lows, but somehow we have added over $1 trillion to the national debt the last couple of years. And my point to people is this: it's really quite simple. I go, imagine that we've added this much debt, okay, in times that statistically, from an economic perspective, are quite good.
Right.
And I understand everybody doesn't have the same experience with the economy. Imagine what it's going to be like when you experience something like 2008 again. A $1 trillion addition to the federal debt in a year will be like way in the rearview mirror. It'll seem like nothing.
I knew it. I knew exactly where you were going when you started to talk about how great the fundamentals are, because that's. I mean, well, listen, it's the same argument behind. It's an argument behind a lot of things with where finance is concerned. And I tell my financial literacy kids this. I'm like, when you see people with a big house and a nice car, 2 nice cars, all the kids have really nice clothes and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you know what a lot of times they also have? A whole lot of debt. Like, don't be, on the one hand, you have all these things going for you, right? Aesthetically speaking, and I'm not saying that the economy's not in good shape, but that debt issue is a serious issue that needs to be addressed, is all I'm saying. And that you can't, just because you have things and things are comfortable, doesn't mean that you can ignore the debt. And it's very similar with our economy. Like, that's going to need to be addressed at some point.
Yeah, and when I wrote my fictional series, you mentioned it earlier in the intro, it's called the Chandler Scott Thriller Series. The first book is actually called 2020, which basically is framed around the U.S. presidential election of the year 2020. That's why I called it that. The backdrop for those books really is financial crisis. And again, what happens from a political perspective when you have the next financial crisis? You've got cyber terrorists creating havoc. And by the way, I don't mean Russian hackers. That's not what I mean. It's something much more pernicious, if you will, than what you've heard about in the news. Much more impactful. And kind of what happens, when you have those conditions for a presidential election. What happens when you have people running for president that have a legitimate chance to win that aren't called Republicans and Democrats? I created 2 political parties in my first book. One of them I called the Theocracy Party, and the other one I called the Independent American Party. And these representatives of those parties in that election, which I won't give away the book, but I mean, they poll very, very strongly in the final tally. And then again, it just shows, I wanted to show people, what happens with these economic conditions, how people will react socially, and again, there's a story around it, right? And then what happens with the election, and the main character, the protagonist, is a journalist, so he's investigating things, and then he discovers things, and how does he reveal that information to the general public? Should he reveal it? So it's a very interesting look. It's not dystopian at all, and it's not real far into the future. I mean, it's actually very, very close to where we are in time right now. But it's to give people a kind of a dramatic view of what could happen in a country when these things continue to evolve the way they've evolving.
And they certainly can. I have a cybersecurity expert that comes on regularly, and occasionally we talk about, things that are going on with AI and things that are going on in the financial situation. But we talk, of course, a lot about cybersecurity in countries and our security as far as, the 5G network that's coming out and the issues with China and that technology and them stealing, but also EMTs. If that were to, we don't have any infrastructure to protect ourselves from an electromagnetic incident. And the first thing that would be affected would be our money. The cyber hacks that I have, and this is something really important I want your listeners to understand about my novel series, is that the battle, if you will, the conflict, the tension isn't the United States versus China, the United States versus Russia. This is the United States versus the United States. They're all very, very strong internal conflicts. And some of the cyber terrors and some of the cyber hacking that you see, particularly in the second book in the series, will blow you away. I mean, you'll think, wow, can that really happen? In some cases, yes. Because I did a lot of research on it, and I have a technology background. In some cases, it's just a little bit in the future. So it really shows you, how the surveillance state can change. And obviously, there's a lot of discussion right now about surveillance based on, what happened in the 2016 election and Attorney General Barr and declassification of documents and so forth. But I'm actually taking this to another level, and it is showing you how the surveillance state would work. Not looking at a presidential election, but how it would affect everybody on a day-to-day basis. And it really is quite chilling. Well, I mean, Orwell, hit that nail on that head, really well. But if you even think about the Amazon Echo, which everybody calls the Alexa, but it's called the Amazon Echo. I try to remind people it's the Echo. The voice prompt is Alexa. but Amazon did that on purpose, so now everybody says it's the Alexa. But think about how much data it records, and think about the fact that there's so many words that you're afraid to use. I'm in education, and I mentioned to you off air that I'm a card-carrying, conservative Republican who happens to also be an educator and adjunct professor because I like to keep my life interesting. And but there's certain words that you're not, allowed to say. Like when I say God bless you, I cringe to one of my kids when they sneeze. I cringe because I know like the day is going to come when somebody's going to be offended that I say God bless you, because they know that I'm a Christian. There was a big article about it in my regional paper. My picture was in it. So if they didn't know, they know for doggone sure now about it. But seriously, there's words that you are not able to say, and what I'm saying about that is, from a security perspective, from a data perspective, all the things that they're collecting from us. When are we going to get to the point where they're monitoring us through the Amazon Echo, and which is the concern of my cybersecurity expert, and other means? We have the facial recognition. When are they going to start using that kind of thing against us? And my guess is that your book probably centers around something to that effect.
Well, I mean, the first book, the backdrop of it, and when you look at the book trailer, you see these eyes, these big giant eyes that are peering out, and the dialogue a lot of times may involve people talking on the phone, and they basically are saying, hey, you know what, let's not talk on the phone anymore, because we know that there's always somebody listening. And it's just become, the one thing that I want to mention is that when economies tend to have, serious contractions, and because I mentioned earlier that, we've constantly asked government for the freedom from, and it requires the state to be bigger. It requires the state to be much more authoritarian. And the books, especially the first book, really shows you that battle, that tension between statism, the making the state as large as possible, and liberty. Well, when you have liberty, it means the absence of a certain amount of statism. Statism says, okay, we're going to guarantee your security, but in order to guarantee your security, we're going to have to do all of these different things. And that's something that really I would encourage your listeners, if they have an interest in reading things like this. The second book really expands that whole concept, and it shows you how you're going to have a segment of people within the country that are really just pushing back against authority. And they are almost like creating their own, I'll throw in a term here for you. They create something called a panarchic state, which basically says, you know what, we don't care what's going on in Washington, D.C. and all these states and so forth. We're kind of living our own life. We want to kind of separate ourselves, not from a secession standpoint, but it's almost like we're going to have our own lives, and we're going to do all these different things. We're going to conduct commerce on the dark net, and we're going to have our own digital currency. And you know what? We don't really need government. And that's a really powerful message that comes out in the second book. And okay, what happens when you have some segment of the population that says, okay, government, that's fine. You guys can screw up everything you want to screw up. We're going to separate ourselves over here. And that these people almost live in a constant digital world. Anyway, just some very interesting things to explore.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you're saying. I'm thinking, I bet that's where Bitcoin ultimately is going to end up, on the dark net. And the only people who are going to end up using it are
Well, I actually created because I do some talks on cryptocurrency and so on. But I created a digital currency that I call DigiNote. And you see people within government, within my book, they're constantly trying to battle to how do we stop these people?
Right.
Because they're because they have this underground economy, so we can't tax it. We don't know what's going on. I've made the state even bigger in the first book. They're trying to exert more control over the economy, so they're trying to figure out how to stop these people, and it's going to be hard to stop because this is all occurring over the internet. Well, if you shut down the internet, you're going to shut down a lot of the economy anyway. So you'll see that in the books that just some different ideas that get discussed and how you deal with it.
Indeed. Well, listen, this hour has been fantastic. Thank you so much. Very, very informative, as I knew it would be, because you're just simply brilliant. I don't know if you were still in the Facey chat, but at one point I typed, "This guy is really, really smart."
I saw that. Yeah, thank you very much.
It's like, he is brilliant. Yes, indeed. Thank you. Well, where can we buy your books and any other information that you want to let our audience know, how we can follow you on social media, anything like that?
I would direct people to my author site, which is jimmosquera.com, JIMMOSQUERA.com. From there, you'll see my nonfiction book series and my fiction book series. You can click into each one of the books, and then you can see I've created a book trailers for all the books. Actually, most of the books, not all of them. The 4 of the books are available on audio as well. So for those that don't like to read and would rather listen to the book, I've recorded them on audio as well. And just go from there, and you'll find the book's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and some of the other outlets as well.
Excellent. I cannot thank you enough for being on Money Talk with Melanie today. I'm sure my audience totally enjoyed it. They were making all kinds of comments, which I'm sure you saw in the Facey chat. Thank you. That was just awesome. That was just wonderful.
Well, great. I'd love to be on your show again. It was a really good hour.
I'd love to have you, because we didn't even talk about some of the other stuff that I wanted to talk about. We have a lot to talk about. Katina Person said she's going to buy the book. She's a regular fan of the show, and she said she's going to buy the book. She was one of the people who was definitely commenting in the Facebook chat. But yes, just brilliant commentary. You just know so much. You read like every book anyway. You did a fantastic job, and I surely hope you come back.
Well, thank you very much. Thanks for having me on.
Indeed. You're listening to Money Talk with Melanie. I'm your business diva, Melanie Collette. That was our guest, Jim Mosquera, a business consultant and author. Pick up his book, Escaping Oz and Observer's Reflection. That is the 3rd in the series of Escaping Oz books. I'm going to have to I feel like I want to pick all 3 up and binge read all of them this weekend, because I will bet that I will learn like 10 billion things that I didn't know about the economy, and I think I know a lot about the economy already. But anyway, and by the by, I just want to mention real quick before I go that I have a couple of comments in a new press release from Project 21. I'm going to post that in the Facey chat if you guys want to check that out. That's on President Trump's, I meant to mention it earlier, on President Trump's new immigration policy. So I'll post that in the Facey chat. I want to thank you all for listening, all of you in the Facey chat, all of you out there in SHR Media Land. If you're listening to this via a download on iTunes or any of the other wonderful podcast platforms, I thank you very much for listening. I want to thank my sponsors, Robert Houston, MrCreditRepair.com, the Tax Mama, Eva Rosenberg, thank you very much, and John Campbell, of course, from Biz Social Personal Touch for supporting Money Talk with Melanie. Remember, all of this is very important because after all, it's your money. Have a fantastic weekend.